So we come to the fifth in our series of studies on the kings of Israel and Judah. Now don't panic, we're not going to go through them all blow by blow. That would take much too much time. We're just going to look at the ones who particularly change history, or from whom we can learn lessons for our own lives. Now last time, you remember, we looked at the bloodshed and the chaos that took place before Omri came to the throne. Now Omri's coming to the throne wasn't that simple either. The people of Israel were divided into two parts. You remember last time that I said some of the people took Omri and made him king, some of them, but not all of them. Some of the others went and took this fellow called Tibni and made him king. Now we've got two kings, Omri and Tibni. I'm sure there's a joke there somewhere, but I can't quite think of it. Now, when there are two kings in one kingdom, that pretty much always ends in tears. Well, remarkably, this time it didn't. For somehow or other, the two kings ruled together for about 2 years. I don't know how they did that. And then, conveniently, Tibni died. And there's no evidence that he died of foul play. And so Omri came to the throne. Now, before I talk about Omri himself, I just want to talk for a few moments about the subject of division. The great blight on the human race is to divide into groups, us and them, and our little group is right. You see it everywhere. The worst civil war of our time has been the war in Syria. We believe that up to 400,000 people have died in that war so far. Every night I need to give thanks that I wasn't born in Syria. But that war in Syria is essentially a war of two parties of Islam, the Sunnis and the Shiites. That division took place just after Muhammad died, 1600 years ago, and it's still going on. They keep fighting between themselves. And it's not just Muslims. Think of Ireland and the division between Catholics and Protestants and all the heartache and death that has caused. And even Scotland wants their independence, for goodness sake. Some years ago, Hout Bay declared itself a republic, all symptoms of the us and them syndrome. There was a man who was marooned on a desert island, and it took about 10 years for them to find him. And when they found him, they were quite impressed. He'd built quite a nice little house for himself. He'd organized a vegetable farm. They noticed up on the one hill there was a building, up on another hill there was a building, and they asked him, "What's that building for?" He said, "Oh, that's the church I go to." And they said, and what's that building? He said, "Oh, well, that's the church I used to go to." The human tendency for division. I had an uncle who worked in Japan as a missionary for 40 years. His name was Uncle Percy. Now, there's a name you never get these days. He married a half-Japanese woman by the name of Amy. Now, I notice the word Amy is coming back somewhat. Auntie Amy had a wicked sense of humor, and I really loved her. Every 7 years, they came back from Japan to South Africa for furlough, and that's when I got to know him. And I remember one night in our lounge, he was showing some slides. And he put up a slide of a very nice-looking group of young Japanese boys and girls, men and women. And he went up to the screen and he pointed to one young man and one young woman. And he said, "Now those two want to get married. And it's a real problem in Japan because there's so few Christians. It's a problem finding suitable Christian partners for these young people. They would be very suitable, but they can't get married. Their parents won't allow it because they come from different castes." Uncle Percy said in Japan, there's really no difference physically between races at all. They all look very much the same. And he went on to say this, "I'm convinced that if God tonight removed all physical differences between human beings, by lunchtime tomorrow we would have found other ways to discriminate against one another." The great blight of the human race, party spirit, a work of the flesh, and I would think that that work of the flesh has caused more death and destruction than perhaps all the others put together. Well, now we come to look at Omri. Now, each of the kings of Israel is given a sentence, a kind of mantra to go with them. Omri is given one that all the others were given. Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord. But then he's given a second one that is given to quite a few of them. He walked in the ways of Jeroboam, who made Israel to sin. But Omri's given a third one. He did more evil than all those who were before him. Now you notice the word evil comes up twice there. In fact, the study of the kings of Israel is pretty much a study in evil. Scott Peck, who wrote the very good book called The Road Less Traveled, wrote another book called The People of the Lie. It was a study of evil. Actually, Scott Peck was asked by the American government to investigate the My Lai massacre, a terrible atrocity that was committed by American soldiers. Apparently, normal boys from America do this evil thing. And this particular picture went right around the world. And Scott Peck studied this incident for the American government. One of the findings he came up with is that evil is easier when you're in a group, especially when there's authority structure and individual responsibility is diminished. And then he came to a conclusion, having studied all these things. He said probably 99% of psychiatrists in America don't believe in Satan and a personal evil. But the more I study it, the more I come to the conclusion that there is a personal force of evil in this world. And so it's not for nothing that Jesus said to us, pray every day, deliver us from the evil one. And then let's look at the legacy that Omri left behind. It's important to ask, what am I going to leave behind? I'm not going to be here forever, so what will my legacy be? Well, I found two things for Omri. The first is in verse 24, Omri built Samaria. Now that may not sound like a very big deal. He founded a town. But that town remained the capital of Samaria right down to the time of Jesus, when he visited the woman at the well there. It lasted over 1,000 years. That's quite an achievement to create something that lasts 1,000 years. And good on Omri. But more important than what I leave behind, I think, is who I leave behind. We read in verse 28, Omri's son Ahab. Now the word Ahab should set our teeth on edge. He left behind a son that matched him blow by blow in evil. And to make things worse, he went and married a foreign wife called Jezebel, who outdid him in wickedness. They were a truly evil couple. Let me tell you about a more recent evil couple, Joseph and Bettina Goebbels. A documentary was done on television recently about the descendants of the Nazi warlords to find out what effect it made on them to be descendants of those people. And it was found that the effect was profound. The one that particularly struck me was Bettina Goebbels. She was the grandniece of Joseph and Magda. Now, Joseph and Magda had no grandchildren of their own, and here's why. They had 6 beautiful children, 5 lovely daughters, and a son. But the night that Hitler committed suicide, Magda went into their room and cracked vials of cyanide between their teeth and killed them all. Then she and Joseph went up on the roof and shot themselves. Evil doesn't get much darker than that. And when they were interviewing the grandniece Bettina, they asked her what effect it had had on her. And she said, I've had myself sterilized. I couldn't bear the thought of having offspring that would pass on those genes and perhaps create another monster. And so her legacy actually was to pass nothing on. And in a way, you must admire that. So who will be my legacy? Of course, I'm a legacy of other people. People have put things into my life that make me what I am today. My dad played a big part in that. But one of the 5 people, I suppose, who put the most into my life was a man called Eddie Prest. Eddie was the greatest children's evangelist and children's worker that I ever saw. When Eddie got in front of a group of children, he lit up. His whole being lit up. He had a particularly wonderful way with boys. He could make a boy feel like a man. And I've often wondered how many people will be in heaven one day because of Eddie's children's ministry. I suspect it will be hundreds and hundreds. Now, in his later life, Eddie wrote a book called Gems for His Crown. It was a book about the history of Scripture Union in South Africa. It wasn't about him. It wasn't like Eddie to write about himself. But I couldn't help feeling that the title of that book would be very apt for Eddie. All those children in heaven are gems in his crown.